All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to Building Financial Health and Strategic Resilience. This workshop is offered by the Massachusetts Community Foundation Partnership. And as you may know, the partnership is made up of 14 Massachusetts-based community foundations who have come together since the start of the coronavirus pandemic to pool resources to strengthen the nonprofit community. My name is Madeline Morgan, and I am the Programs and Services Manager at the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network. I'm joined today by our presenter, Sandy McKinley, who I'll introduce in a moment, and Phyllis Corkum of Philanthropy Massachusetts. Philanthropy Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network are pleased to work with the foundations to bring these resources to the Massachusetts nonprofit community. We're thrilled to be joined by Sandy McKinley of Sector WIN this morning. Over the past month, Sector WIN has been working with nonprofits on adapting their financial strategies during this uncertain time. And the Community Foundations Partnership has worked with Sandy on multiple workshops to provide nonprofits with the tools and guidance they need to navigate their finances. Before we get into this morning's session, I just want to go over some logistical elements. We ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation, and I'd also encourage you to select active speaker view at the top of your screen so that the active speaker will appear more prominently on your screen. If you have any questions during any part of the presentation, please feel free to submit them in the chat box to everyone, or if you'd like, you can submit them directly to me at Madeline Morgan, MNN. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat box at any time, and we're making a recording of this webinar and we'll distribute it afterwards with the slides. One more item before I hand it over to Sandy. I want to mention some of the exciting sessions we have coming up this month. On February 17th, we have a session on how nonprofits can break through the virtual world of fundraising and communications. And on February 23rd, we have a webinar on alliances, mergers, and strategic restructuring. Additional programs are being held through April and can be viewed and registered for at the link that I will post shortly in the chat. With that quick intro, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the presentation over to our presenter, Sandy.
Thank you, Madeline. It's wonderful to be with everybody today, and it's great to see so many familiar names coming in through the waiting room. Thank you, everybody, and I really appreciate everyone coming in this morning and to talk about scenario planning and budgeting, something that we are doing a lot of these days in kind of the world of uncertainty. So, I mean, our goals for today, right? So, I put here on our kind of our agenda or our goals. We are living in an age where every time we put down plans, every time right before the ink, as the ink gets dry, things seem to change. So, what are we, as leaders and managers of organizations? How do we try to like work toward financial health and strategic resiliency in times like this? So what I'd like to do today is walk through some very practical processes for us to adapt and adopt to help us build a culture of financial flexibility while maintaining our focus on what we are drawn to do for our communities and for our constituents in the long term. So if you've been to any of my webinars before, you know that my guiding aspiration, which I hope is all of our guiding aspiration, is strategic resilience and financial health. And by strategic resilience, I mean the ability of us to anticipate and adapt to that fluidity in the environment. And it doesn't have to be just because of our of the pandemic or economic instability, but it's that fluidity that is always in our operating environment. But it's the second part of that is our ability to maintain focus on our organization's mission and our long-term horizon, right? So that strategic resilience is being able to kind of to bend in the wind while keeping our feet grounded, or our roots grounded. And financial health is really having the types and amounts of money to cover both the full cost of our operations and being able to handle those bumps in the road and at times pursue opportunity that is put in front of us or that we anticipate. So those two things is what my guiding aspirations are, and what I and my firm aspire for the sector. And in getting there, and again, if you've been to any of my workshops, I think that after 25 years of doing this, people say, "Oh gosh, Jenny, yes, but how do we get there?" And by no means is it easy, but I do believe that we can break it down, and we can try to focus on ways and elements of getting there. And by that I mean, what are the elements of strength and resistance? What do we really have to? How do we focus our attention? And I see it in five with kind of five elements. First is really, our element is kind of our programs and services, what we do and how we do it. It's the work that we do. It's why we are drawn to what we do. The second is, because we're a people serving people sector, our people and culture. So those who do the work, it's our boards, it's our volunteers, it's kind of our internal people to our organizations. The third is really our relationships, those external to our organization, groups and people and other organizations who help support and help us advance our work with our constituents and our communities. The fourth is those, systems and operations, those necessary things that help us get the work done. It's our facilities, our technologies, our infrastructure, our processes. Those things need care and feeding just as much as anything else in what we do. And the fourth is money and finance. I am a strategic financial consultant. My background is in finance, and people are frequently surprised that I put money last in this wheel, but it's because that money is not the only thing that is a strength. Strength is not just how big our balance sheet is or how big our budget is. Our strength is all of these things, and we have to take them into the totality to really understand and appreciate everything that we are as an organization. So our programs and services, our people and culture, our relationships, our systems and operations, and our money and finance, and what makes us strong and resilient organizations. And really thinking about how all of those things play together and evolve over time is what we are kind of juggling and managing as leaders and managers of organizations. So as we're thinking about planning, and really any type of planning, there are two things that I believe are really help guide us. And if you attended our earlier webinar on gathering community and constituent input, this slide will really look familiar. And I really do believe that if we're thinking about starting many ventures, like where do we start? And for me, and I think many of you, I heard some nice feedback from that other webinar. The things that guide our priorities and is really our mission, of course, why we get up in the morning, but also it's what it's what is valued by our constituents in our community. Like, so as we're entering in and thinking about scenario planning and prioritization, still orienting around our mission and what is valued most by our constituents and community. So what I mean by that is mission. What were you created to do? What was the organization founded and created to do? But then also really interrogating that and taking a moment to pause and ask ourselves, is that still relevant? And but more importantly, is it still relevant in the same way as it was in the past? And just taking that moment to reflect and saying, we're going to go into an exercise in thinking about scenarios and priority setting. And like, just let's check ourselves and say, where are we on that relevance? It doesn't have to be a long drawn out introspection, but like let's just in a way tell truth to ourselves or reflect on that. And the second part is value. What do we need? What do our constituents and our community value, need, and want? And then the second part is, how do you know? And we talked about that in an earlier webinar. And then third, and if you're able to do this, and I would encourage you to, if you are able, how are your constituents and community involved in your decision making now and going forward? Because that is just so important as we are thinking about both gaining support and thinking about that desire for that collaboration and community-based engagement. with our with our organizations. So mission and value, always really thinking about that, especially as we're going into any type of planning. So really, this is what we're here to do today. So we're really thinking about prioritization to scenario budgeting. And let's just, think about first, what do those terms mean? Where are we? Where are we? What is that spectrum? I start with prioritization because I think it helps bring focus. And prioritization in this regard to me is just gaining that collective agreement of the importance of programs and services to deliver on our mission and strategy. So what are we doing? And really, in a way, what's most important right now? And do we agree on that? I think it's important. For me, that's an important conversation that I have with my clients. And it's an important one that for us to lay on the table as we are doing our about to enter our process. Scenarios are, I think we all do scenarios and planning, especially at this moment in time, very naturally, right? Humans are scenario planners. We're thinking of contingencies all the time. And we do it without even, we just do it naturally. We're always thinking of the what ifs. Scenarios are just the range of possibilities. In this arena, it's thinking about the possible financial and non-financial outcomes of what might happen in the future if things play out a certain way. That's just what scenarios are. And budgeting, that term never changes, right? It's a plan in numbers based on reasonable assumptions. That documents our priorities and our goals, and it's used to set expectations with our staff and our board and our funders. Those are kind of, those three terms. Scenario budgeting kind of marries those things together. It maps our current and necessary resources based on our scenario assumptions, but it also articulates, it helps us narrate what actions we will need to take if and when circumstances change. So it doesn't take the place of a budget. The budget is still there, but it helps us manage before and after. Think through what actions we will take prior to them occurring, either good or bad. Helps us plan for opportunity, and it helps us manage risk. Right, so it's a different. It's layering it's layering an exercise on that says, okay, we've thought about a budget, but let's also think about different paths that we could take throughout a defined period of time, typically a year, sometimes 18 months. But it helps us think about important factors and seeing effects of potential different pathways. So that's really what we're thinking about. So today we're going to really think about prioritization, think about scenarios, and that scenario budgeting. The reason I skipped over traditional budgeting is not because I don't think it's important. I think there's a lot of existing resources out there on traditional just budgeting, what I want to concentrate on is how do we fold in prioritization scenarios and scenario budgeting into that. So let's start with prioritization. The first thing when I work with my clients and we think about prioritization, there is always a flurry of activity around, there's always a lot of ideas on the table. And the way I focus and I orient my team is around, like, what do we have, where do we have control? And you may have seen this or something like this previously or in other, it's there are versions of this in kind of the wellness and mental health and behavioral health arenas, but just thinking about, like, when we're thinking about our priorities, really thinking about what do we as leaders and managers of our organizations, what do we have control over? And that's really where we want to focus our, really want to think about like setting our priorities over what we have control. So we can think about we have control over our requirements, over our needs for the most part. We have control over our choices, our narrative, and our priorities. Now, we don't have control over the economy, necessarily the trajectory of the pandemic, although I put in here, wear your mask, wash your hands, social distance, get the vaccine, all of those good things. And we don't have control over decisions made by others. And in the middle, we have some influence, right? We can have some influence over time frame. We can have, some influence over our short-term outcomes, and we can have some influence over the expectation of others. But when we're thinking about prioritization, I really want us to think about what can we control as leaders and managers of our organizations. And I think that tends to help us help break through the overwhelm of what should be, kind of take a first cut at breaking through the overwhelm of our priorities. So really, what can we control? What can we control? What can we control? And prioritization, I love using this. I love using kind of mapping to help organizations like think about priorities, especially during times of change. My friends over at the Center for Community Investment put this particular exercise together, which I've adapted. So I want to send kudos out to them. But this is a wonderful and very quick mapping exercise that is accessible to, I think, anyone. I've used it now dozens of times, and I find it just really very powerful in its simplicity. So thinking about prioritization, I want to first think about an organization's, your current and legacy priorities. What do you have that is still relevant and active today? What are you still doing that is relevant and active today? And that's not for me to answer. That's really for you to answer. The second thing that we want to map when we're thinking about our prioritization is what is emerging in your organization, or is emerging or existing but newly prioritized. So something that you may have done as in your organization, but it wasn't always a priority, but it's bubbling up now. A lot of things that have come up over the past year have been either people's virtual or online offerings. Or out of house offerings, if you will. So current and legacy priorities are emerging or new or existing things that are now newly prioritized. The third, is really things that are a priority, but they're not necessarily a priority right now. We know that they will continue to be a priority in the future. We're not going to get rid of them, but we know that they will come back, but just not right now. So we know that because of mission and the community values them, that they will be back into our rotation. They will continue to be a priority, but just not right now, for whatever reason. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute. The fourth are those questionable or unknown things, largely because we don't have enough data, right? We don't know. Those things are kind of on hold because those things we just don't know. And the fifth are things that we know we have to honor and release, that are just no longer going to work for us, but we are going to honor and release those things. And there are a few things that may have emerged with your organizations that fall into that category. But when we think about prioritization, first we're thinking of our current and legacy, those newly emerged things. Then we're thinking of those things that will come back just at a future time. Fourth, we're going to think of those things that, well, we just don't have enough data to make a decision. And fifth, well, those things we have to honor and release them. On the honor and release, there's kind of a subcategory there. We know that we have to honor and release them, but we might not know when we're going to do it. So they're almost like on permanent hold. And I recognize that some programs or activities might fall into that category. So let me give you an example. This is a small community-based organization that I've anonymized and just pared down for sake of an example. So this is an organization that does it's in a small city. I would even say not a very small city. And they do kind of everything. They truly serve the community. They do out of school time. They do food insecurity. They partner with their local community health center. They do just everything you would expect for a small multi-service community-based organization. So when they went through this exercise, their current and legacy priorities were their kind of out of school time services. They have a lot of school-aged kids, pupils who they worked with in the normal times. They provided like tutoring services, out of school time, childcare, and like kind of support services to the small school district, including like transportation, like to and from out of school time programs. So for them, like they saw that still as a priority, but also ways to how could they still support families who were now learning remotely, and many of their families did not have caregivers who were able to stay home with children during the pandemic because of their jobs. They also did a fair amount of in-house therapy, or provided spaces for in-house therapy for people overcoming addiction. So that was still a priority for them. And they delivered medically tailored meals for the elderly. So they did a lot of work because they have an industrial kitchen. And so they did a lot of work. They do a lot of work around food. So for them, like the three things were children's services or student pupil services. They're like supporting those overcoming addiction, and medically tailored meals. Some of the emerging priorities for them were kind of supporting the out of school time learning, or the at home or virtual learning, arranging or supporting telehealth services with their local health center, with whom they have a tremendous partnership. And so they were able to redeploy some staff to be able to work in partnership and collaboration with their local health center. And they were also able to work with some other partners to help their neighbors and community access fresh or healthy food for at-risk neighbors. So that was different for them, but an emerging priority. They're pausing and pause and resume later. Their third ranked priorities were their on-site academic programs, their on-site therapies, including their free childcare programs. They were not able to get that special designation for frontline workers, that childcare program, and their on-site healthy cooking and nutrition classes. And then they're questionable and unknown. They did a lot of in-home work, which they would like to do in the future, but they're not quite sure that will be possible for them, just given the trajectory. They've decided that they're going to honor and release their program for seniors to volunteer. They thought that right now and moving into the future that it's just too risky. Their average age of senior volunteers was in their 70s, and given the pandemic and into the foreseeable future, they're not sure that they want to take that risk, or that their seniors would want to risk that. So they're going to honor and release their senior volunteer program at this moment. And so the board has made that decision. So this really helped them, and I recognize I'm going through this in a webinar, really helped them go through this process of helping them prioritize ahead of their budgeting process. Again, this was in the fall, and so a little different than So as kind of they were going into their budgeting process for 21. So for them, we said we're going back to that idea of control. So they knew what their priorities were: their school, out of school time services, supporting their at home and virtual learning, um, their therapy, their therapies, and their partnership with telehealth and their community health center, and then their work around food. So those are their big buckets. And then, they had a little bit less control over these other things, these on-site academic programs, these on-site therapies, the free childcare program, and then those other on-site cooking programs and the nutrition classes. Budget planning is generally not everybody's favorite exercise, and it's kind of like half gazing into a crystal ball. It's half data gathering and half gazing into a crystal ball. And so how do we build kind of build something that is grounded and rooted in reality, right? But then also has that flexibility to help us. So from setting those priorities, we want to move to think about what might be our scenarios. So we have our priorities. Now, how do we move to scenarios? It's my practice to ask my clients to start with stories, to start with words, not numbers. And if we start diving into numbers, I find that we just get lost. We start to get lost in the numbers. So I want us to really just paint the narrative. And we want to think about building out those kind of multiple plans. Just paint me the picture in each of our scenarios. Focus first on what we know and what we can control, what we know about those 5 factors that we talked about, like the strategic resilience and financial health, about programs, about people, relationships, money, systems, and money. And then think about the different what ifs. So what we've just, our priorities, and then what are the different what ifs, the different combinations of those priorities and our different kind of timelines. How might they play out? How might those what are the different scenarios? What are the different what ifs? And then and then write those down, right? Like it's almost like writing down 3 different stories. And then review those written plans with our trusted advisors. Again, no numbers, but just say, hey, Madeline, this is what I'm thinking. This is my base scenario, and this is what I'm thinking through, just in words. What does this sound like? You know my organization really well. What am I not thinking of? And have those conversations with trusted advisors. And this is what I'm thinking of if we do get, this contract and it grows, or if we're able to have in-person services. Really test your assumptions and test those scenarios with a trusted advisor. Again, prior to putting those numbers on the page. And this is how I start putting form to this with clients. You can name these anything you want. I've seen clients name the scenarios, all different things. I try not to say base, best, and worst, because scenarios don't have to be like best and worst. They just need to be real. They want to be realistic and reasonable. I think about your base budget is thinking about what you reasonably expect will happen, right? Like that is, like, in a way, telling truth to ourselves in what you reasonably as a human being think will happen based on the data that you have and what is it within your control. We want to think that revenue is somewhat drivers based, right? It's not pulled out of thin air. It is tied to previous data and is appropriately, what I mean by appropriately discounted is that if you are soliciting 100 new individual donors, that you are not assuming that 100 individual donors are going to fully fund you at the ask that you have made of them, that you are discounting those asks by some percentage. We want to make sure that our expenses are understood by the fixity, right? So are they a fixed expense that doesn't change, or are they a variable expense that changes by activity? And what drives them? How do expenses behave? And then thinking also too between operating and non-operating. Operating, what you do day to day, week to week, year to year, and non-operating is kind of one time or extraordinary. So we went over a lot of these terms in our last webinar 2 weeks ago in financial boot camp. Typically, if there's a base or a base alternate, base plus or a base alternate, it's a reasonable plan that exceeds our operating expenses, or it's a reasonable plan that takes a reasonable alternative direction and results in a similar financial outcome and programmatic outcome. So it's the other plan, right? But it's reasonable. So it's either the reasonable plan that exceeds operating expectations, something I loved. I had a wonderful colleague or wonderful client in Texas who used to call this the jelly side up plan, meaning that if the toast fell off the counter and it fell jelly side up, and she would describe the base minus would be the jelly side down plan. The toast fell off the counter and it landed jelly side down. I thought that was always the most creative names for the scenarios that I ever had, the jelly side up and the jelly side down. But this is the reasonable plan that exceeds operating expectations, or a reasonable plan that takes a reasonable alternative direction and has a similar financial and programmatic outcome. So there we are. And that's just a general, some general guiding principles here. So going back to my client, my fictional town of Boroughboro Community Center, but based on my client, and again, pared down for us in our webinar today. This is how we kind of thought about their building out their kind of scenarios. So first, their base scenario, they would say that the center paused on-site programs, to the public. Essential staff worked in the building, but most will work remote until, at least June of this year. Their out-of-school time services will remain virtual until the district allows for in-person instruction. They'll support virtual learning. The food program remains, their contract goes through 2023. The health center partnership remains and will continue through 22. There's an annual anticipated increase of 20%, and it requires 2 additional staff. And their fundraising targets, they hit their fundraising targets between 80 and 100% of target, right? So they're thinking that that's their anticipated target rate of their fundraising target. And they're discounting a little bit because they had an overwhelming show of support from the community during COVID last year, and they don't think that they can't really base their they want to discount their fundraising because of people's economic situation in their community. So that's some of their highlights. In reality, their base scenario is there's much more narrative there. It doesn't fit on the slide here, so I pared it down for us today. Their base plus / base alternate, said, listen, the school district might approve in person and might give us license to be in the school and interact in the school district by March. And if we can do it by March, we can continue to provide services to students in person, but we're still going to have our virtual services, and that changes like the way that we operate. And if we can, if things move in a certain direction, we think that we can, we can run up kind of our on-site summer programs. But we have to make that call by June 1st, and we would have to make sure that our enrollment is around 50 to 60%, but we would start camp after July 4th. And if that all happened, we would have to have our staff increased by 6. And then the jelly side down, we would really have to think, if our remote programming wasn't working right, if we were having negative pushback, or it was being undersubscribed, we would really have to make that call by Q2, or like that would be one thing, kind of a negative indicator for them. Or if more than 15% of their staff were impacted, negatively impacted by the pandemic and unable to work, that would be a big negative indicator for us. And or if our fundraising trends really were impacted below a particular target rate by Q2, and the impact on their staffing would be substantial. This is a people serving people organization, and so in a way the only financial levers that they have is really on their labor force, right? So being able to furlough or reduce either headcount or hours is really thinking about how they are building these examples, or building these scenarios. So again, building these scenarios, like building out the narratives, is really how they are thinking of taking from priorities, building the narratives, and now thinking about, okay, how do we take these narratives and put them into dollars? So we come back to control. So we move from narratives and to numbers. Again, thinking what is in our financial control, what is in our control. Going back to what we talked about in the last webinar on the financial boot camp, we'll start a little bit with revenue and expense. First, thinking about expense, what is easier or harder to change? When can we tighten our belt? And then also thinking about what then has the least impact on our mission, and what has the least impact on our future operations. So thinking about going into our planning with where, not only what can we cut, but what is easier to cut, what has the least impact on the future, and what has the least impact on our mission. With revenue, it's a little tougher. I mean, is there an opportunity to raise more money? Is there an opportunity if you are grant funded? Is there and if those grants have restrictions on them, is there an opportunity to release restrictions? Have a conversation with the funder to release those restrictions. And then also just operating performance. What are you able to reserve, to absorb as an organization? On the balance sheet, it really comes down to cash and liquidity. Does your organization have reserves? Are they accessible? And is it prudent to do so? And it's really you're really thinking about cash flow. Is the issue one of timing? Are you waiting on cash but the cash will come in? Or is it an issue of not having cash and so it's an issue of really business model profitability, and that it's not an issue of cash flow. It's truly an issue of shortage of cash. So that's an issue of model. There's things like, also thinking about if it is an issue around cash flow, if it's a timing issue, can you work with your vendors to renegotiate terms, but then also recognizing, especially as a community-based organization, that is something that you are asking perhaps another community vendor to take on a hardship. There are those things too, if you have if there are planned capital repairs and improvements, if that is an opportunity as well. But then also we're looking at organizations too that are investing in their facilities to reopen, and some of those repairs, cannot be put off, or improvements cannot be put off. The arrow here just shows us, it kind of goes from easier to harder, and kind of faster to longer term, and in kind of order of implementation. So thinking then, as we're looking to, start to move into from narration to numbers, what is our, what is easier, what is harder, what do we have control over, what do we have less control over? So part one, I want us to think, taking those, that narration, and then start just like, again, before putting in those numbers, really think about what are those impacts on each one of the line items, or each category of line items. So at the top, I have, the question, how do our priorities play out when, and then I have each of our scenarios. And then on the rows, I have what is the impact on? So you'll see, hopefully familiar rows like contracts, donors, philanthropy, kind of one-time revenue, expenses, which are your personnel expenses, your contractors, your utilities, supplies, and just other expenses. And then working with the team and asking the questions, how do our priorities play out when in the base scenario, what's kind of the impact on our contracts in our base scenario? And really going through and thinking about, okay, in our base scenario, our contracts are secured with the district and our health center. In our base plus scenario, we do have increasing revenue if we go in person, and we have that contract is approved through the end of the year. But in our base minus scenario, if our online program is down, our per pupil reimbursement decreases, right? So really going through and saying, okay, in each one of these scenarios, this is how our contract revenue behaves. Similarly, with our base scenario, we're anticipating, I want to anticipate in our numbers a 10%, a 20% decrease in fundraising to account for the COVID, so what we thought was a one-time COVID bump. In our base scenario, our base plus scenario, we're not going to budget a decrease in giving. But in our base minus scenario, gosh, we're going to anticipate a 40% decrease in fundraising, but we also want to trigger this scenario at a 20% decrease in fundraising. We know that if we hit that 20% decrease in fundraising, we have to take some action, right? So we're drawing out a little bit more detail, and as we are working to, we're going deeper into this planning. So philanthropy, again, we're anticipating a decrease in our base scenario because of the extraordinary support during COVID. In our base scenario, we're still anticipating a decrease, or a very conservative lot, and then our base minus, and so on. For this organization, they counted a one-time multi-year unrestricted grant as one-time, as one-time revenue, and they kind of put it there. And as you can see, kind of going down the line and asking in each one of these scenarios, how is everything different? And really kind of in a way, not just double clicking into numbers, but double clicking in how these things behave. I'll step back that it's really tempting to skip this, this exercise. I find that it is an important part of the planning process, because especially for non-financial managers and board members, because it gives a sense of that, those financial dynamics without getting lost in the numbers. And it talks about it's not just the what, it's like the so what and the now what. It gives it avoids the kind of future conversations of why, like, well, why did this happen? It 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 garners like buy-in to future plans, and it helps make those what I call the pre-decisions, or like kind of the pre-understanding, which is really the point of a lot of the scenario budgeting. So, excuse me. All right. So how does this like materialize? So I tried to put this into a cleaner version of a spreadsheet, but of course, the spreadsheets never show up great on, on a slide. But ultimately, you do want to get this to a point where it's really a kind of a side-by-side comparison. And you're going to have your board approved budget. Your board is still going to approve a budget. It's going to be your base scenario. In this case, in this just simple example, my base scenario is in green, and they're, they have a revenue of $640,000. They have expenses of $639,500. They have a modest surplus of $500,000. They are squeaking by, but they feel it's an extraordinary year. They typically would like to have a surplus of something larger so that they can cover their full costs, but it's an extraordinary year. And that's their board approved kind of base scenario. Of course, their budget would be much more detailed, but we're presenting it here in the webinar. And they would have there are more specific line items here, and they would kind of narrate notes. But alongside, they would have their kind of alternate scenarios. I could have them on a different page that would show kind of what the base plus scenario looked like and the base minus. Then we would want to also have what triggers us to go to the base minus or the base plus. Many of you might be really familiar with that reforecast of record, which is something that typically happens if your organization does it at the midpoint of the year, at the halfway mark. Many of my organizations are doing at the quarter mark and saying, do we need to have a reforecast of record? And that's where I would recommend most organizations making that decision. Do we, at the end of a quarter, or at the midpoint, need to think about that reforecast or activating one of our other scenarios? And does this still make sense? So really thinking about it, really asking ourselves, is this are we on track? If so, great. But is our revenue, our expenses behaving in the way that we anticipated? If yes, well, good, I'm glad we checked. And if not, how is it behaving differently and why? Because it's not just about the numbers coming in or the money coming in, it's about how money is flowing in and how it's being used. So when I say behaving, is it coming in the way that we anticipate? Is it being used in the way that we anticipate? It's more than just the bottom line. So actively, so when I think about building resilience, it's thinking about this actively managing these budgets. So so planning and budgeting and monitoring and reflecting is this kind of continual process, right? So we want to think of plan based on our priorities set by mission, and what is valued by our constituents and our communities. Budget based on what we know and we can reasonably predict. Monitor always, and then always reflect, and then think about this kind of movement back and forth, and think about when it is really time, if at all, to reforecast. And then finally, if scenarios help us define our financial impact, define the potential impact of risks and opportunities. And I don't want to discount that opportunity. I've seen, as much as I have seen impact and risk, and I have also seen a tremendous amount of opportunity in this past year. And I think that our organizations that are resilient are ones that are able to take that deep breath, consider possibilities, and think about, what they can do. Ones that have thought about scenarios and done a little bit of that pre-planning tend to be able to go into those conversations about tend to go into tend to be able to manage that change, even if they don't have the strongest balance sheet, even if they don't have a clear path for managing through deficits, but they tend to go into it a little bit stronger, a little bit more, with a little bit more emotional well-being if we think about some of the scenarios ahead of time. So with that, I'm coming to the end of my scenario webinar, and I am more than happy to take questions. Let's see if there's any. Great. So there's somebody who said, as a new nonprofit, we're not eligible for PPP. How do we navigate that story? So Erin, I'd just be interested, is it the not eligible for PPP navigate the story, or as a new nonprofit?
Sorry, I was trying to type quicker so I could get my question out, but I'm not that quick at typing. I'm just curious, not as a new nonprofit, but really as a nonprofit that can't receive PPP funding. And I feel like so many nonprofits have been able to utilize that, and it's really helpful. But again, that's a big chunk of potential income that we're not eligible for because we received our 501c3 status in October. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about creating these scenarios, but then also trying to tell that story about missing out on that, but still needing to close the gap. I know it's not like a fully formed question, but I'm just curious if you could touch on that a little bit more.
So here's my thought on especially organizations that are new, right? So you're new for a reason. And I'm assuming that you kind of met a need or like are filling a gap. And so so thinking about articulating like why you are meeting a need or what gap you are filling, and thinking about who is hearing that and who needs to hear that. There are plenty of organizations that didn't get PPP for various reasons, but I think it's the articulating like why you exist, that mission, and then thinking about like what the community or your constituents are valuing in what you are and what you are doing or how you are serving is it's really getting back to those basics.
Sorry, my chat box isn't working, so I just unmuted myself. Again, as a new nonprofit, and I hope this might resonate with others as well, what do you think the divide should be working with board members in both educating them about our nonprofit and our financial situation, and then also kind of course correcting and including the caveat of COVID? So again, a new organization, a new board, individuals that have potentially served on boards before, but there's varying levels and degrees of understanding in financial sustainability and financial stability. So I'm just curious if you could touch on how much time really needs to be spent on not only the financial component of the organization for the board, but also what component and what time should also focus on what the picture looks like in COVID, because COVID hopefully will not last forever, but it is such a big chunk. So I'm just wondering what that divide looks like.
Right. I personally, and in my practice, I'm a huge proponent. I work exclusively with executive directors and boards, and I'm a huge proponent that like boards and the executive team really need to be on the same page about finance. I mean, boards like are the financial and legal agents, like they are the fiduciary agents of the organization. So they have an obligation to know about the financial situation. And I think there are a number of ways that you can kind of help steward them toward, really understanding, not just singing out of the same songbook, but singing the same song. So there are resources for kind of board education on what it means, what nonprofit finance is all about, and what they need to keep their eyes on. I mean, they should know kind of the sources of revenue, how money is spent, what you own, your assets, what you owe, your liabilities, and then kind of your net assets, what you own free and clear, like those, and that includes what your liquidity, how much cash is accessible. To you, accessible and available to you at any one time. So I'm a huge proponent that all board members should know that. They should want to know that too, since they are the legal and fiduciary agents of the organization. But I think that there are a tremendous number of resources out there, and I suspect, Madeline, there's probably some at MNN and at BoardSource and other organizations that that you could point them to, either webinars or self-directed guides that they could kind of read through to kind of just get a primer on what they should know.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in here in terms of some resources if that's helpful.
Yeah.
The Massachusetts Nonprofit Network website, which is on the same website that I linked earlier with the Community Foundations Partnership, we have a whole resources section. So if you click on that resources section, there's lists of resources related to starting a nonprofit, to managing your board, to developing capital campaigns, fundraising goals, managing your workforce, volunteer management, et cetera, et cetera. So if you take a look at our website, which is again linked there in the chat, that'll have all those resources and additional guidance. And please feel free to reach out to us directly if you have any other questions about any of those items.
Any other questions? Thank you. How does this process inform or respond to an existing strategic plan? That's a really great question. I think that for strategic, right now, strategic plans are, people are really just wondering what to do with them. And I think that that you can use this process to look at your kind of work plan, or what you are doing this year, for what your goals are for this year in the strategic plan, and overlay like this year's goals as a scenario, right? And to say, start with the prioritization exercise and lay this year's, I don't know how your strategic plan is set up, but you might have, what are your goals for 2021? And does that still, and use that prioritization matrix and prioritization exercise and try to use that as a reconciliation. So that's the first thing I would do, and see how that trues out. If it trues out, okay, great. Now go and use that, do the second thing and say, okay, what scenarios, how is this going? How are we going to use this to plan our budget, or inform our budget process, or track our budget if you've already started your budget for this, or already have a board approved budget for this year? And what are our contingencies and different paths? Because what if we have a banner year, or what if something goes sideways? How not only does that impact our budget, but how might that impact our goals related to our strategic plan? Does it take us off track? Does it, what would have to change? How does that impact us in 2 years? How does it impact us in 1 year? How does it impact us in 5 years? And do we have to adjust? So I would start with that prioritization exercise and kind of where you are in your strategic plan, and to say, do the priorities of the strategic plan, where we are right now, still align with our current priorities? I'm happy to take other questions either here or I have my contact info here. You can email me or call me. All right. And I know that Madeline will send out the materials.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, we will send out the recording and the slides this afternoon, so keep an eye out for that. Additionally, again, in that chat box, there's the link to the page, which has all recordings from past webinars. So all the webinars that Sandy referenced today, you can go back and watch those at any time. Thank you, Sandy, so much for joining us today and sharing this great information and these resources. And thank you everyone else for tuning in today, and have a great rest of your week.